The folder had my birthday on it, and I checked it 3 times before I let myself react. March 2018, Providence. I'd been working at the Municipal Archives on Dorrance Street for about 8 months. The main storage was in the basement level, cold enough that I wore a fleece under my cardigan even in summer. 2 rows of overhead fluorescents that took a good 10 seconds to warm up when you flipped the switch at the bottom of the stairs. A specific smell lived down there. Old paper, the plastic of the archival sleeves, and something chemical from the dehumidifier they ran in the corner, humming so constantly you stopped hearing it after 20 minutes. The nearest bathroom was 1 floor up, and if you were alone in the stacks, which I usually was, you could hear the pipes settle in the walls above you. The work was boring, mostly. I'd been assigned to a backlog of miscellaneous fawns that had been shifted around during the archive's move in 2015, and never properly recatalogued. Most of it was junk. Old property assessment records, planning commission notes from the 90s, personnel files for city workers who had died decades ago. My job was to open each folder, verify the contents matched the label, and either refile it or pass it up for digitization. I was on my 3rd card of the week when I found it. The folder was in a beige file box labeled Miscellaneous Personnel / Pre-Review 2015. Plain manila, no tab, held closed with one of those old string and button closures. Nothing on the outside except a handwritten label. First name, last name, date of birth, all mine. I actually laughed, out loud, in the empty room, because my first thought was that someone was messing with me. A coworker's joke, maybe. My birthday was coming up in a few weeks, and Karen from upstairs was the type to do something dumb. Then I noticed the box. It hadn't been touched in a long time. There was a fine dust on top of the row of folders where dead skin and paper fibers had built up over years. The folder with my name was tucked between 2 others in the middle of the box, and the dust line ran unbroken across the top edges. If someone had planted this recently, the dust would not line up. I checked the sticker on the outside of the box. It had the archive's old inventory system on it, the one they'd used before the move. Beneath that, a small notation in pencil, received March 2015. I'd started at this archive in November 2017. I took the folder over to my desk, sat down, pulled the string loose. The first thing on top was a printout of my Facebook profile picture from 2014, the one where I was standing in front of my sister's apartment in Cranston, holding her cat. It had been printed on regular office paper, in color, and the date at the bottom of the page was July 12th, 2014. Someone had printed the page directly from Facebook. My full name was visible. My workplace at the time was visible. It was the kind of thing you'd get if you weren't logged in, viewing a public profile from the outside. Under that, another printout, my Twitter, back when I still used it. A thread of tweets from that same summer, complaining about my commute from the east side to the coffee shop I worked at before I went back to school. Someone had highlighted, in yellow, the streets I mentioned in passing. Wickenden, Hope, Thayer, the names of 2 bars I liked. Even a joke I'd made about the guy who worked at the corner bodega. Under that, in a plastic sleeve, a folded sheet of loose-leaf paper. I opened it. It was a schedule. Handwritten in blue pen, no crossings out, not printed, not a spreadsheet. Someone had written out, by hand, my weekly movements for what looked like most of a month. Monday, leaves apartment 7:40, catches 60 bus at Wayland, arrives coffee shop 8:15, off shift 3:30, library till 6-ish, home. Tuesday, same. Wednesday, no morning shift, gym on Broadway 9 to 10:30. It went on for both sides of the page, small margins, neat handwriting, slightly slanted right. The letters pressed hard enough into the paper that I could feel the impressions with my thumb on the back. The apartment address at the top was one I'd lived at in 2015, the last address before I moved in with my boyfriend. I'd only lived there 14 months. I put the paper down and stared at it for a while. I could hear the dehumidifier. I could hear a chair scraping upstairs. That was it. Then I kept going. There were 4 photographs, all printed on regular photo paper, 4 by 6, the kind you'd get at a CVS or a drugstore. The first was me at the bus stop on Wayland, in a jacket I hadn't owned since 2016. The second was me walking into the gym on Broadway, seen from across the street, one earbud dangling. The third was me, in a bookstore on Thayer, standing in the aisle, reading the back of something. That one had been taken through the window from outside, and you could see a reflection in the glass, but the reflection was blurred, and I couldn't make anything out of it. The fourth was of me on a beach, Narragansett from the look of the pier in the background. I was sitting on a towel. My hair was longer. I remembered that day. I'd gone with my sister and a friend of hers, a woman named Beth I'd only met twice. We drove down early because the parking got bad after 10. The photograph was taken from behind me, at an angle that suggested somebody sitting maybe 30 feet back. Not from the boardwalk, from the sand. I had no memory of anyone being near us. It was a weekday. The beach was mostly empty. I remembered that specifically because Beth kept saying how nice it was to have the place to ourselves. At the very back of the folder was one more page, a photocopy of what looked like an internal city listing. My mother's address in East Providence was circled. I sat with the folder for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent above me flickered once and settled, the way they did. I want to say I had some big reaction. I didn't. I remember feeling very calm, in a way that wasn't really calm, more like I'd stopped being able to feel anything at all. I was thinking practical things. Who has access down here? Who had access down here in 2015? Where did this box come from? Whether anyone at the front desk had watched me go into the stacks that morning, whether they were watching now. The archive had cameras in the reading room and at the loading dock, not down in the stacks. I looked up at the doorway. Nobody there. Of course nobody was there. The building had maybe 6 people in it on a Tuesday afternoon. The trained archivist move would have been to log the folder as unusual content, notify my supervisor, and let a proper chain of custody handle it, which is exactly what I did not do. I put the folder in my bag. I closed the file box, reshelved it, and made a note in my log that the box had been reviewed with no items of interest. I signed out at 5:15 like normal, said goodnight to Denise at the front desk, walked to my car. I didn't drive home. I drove to my boyfriend's mom's place in Warwick because it was the only address I could think of that wasn't mine. I sat on her couch and made him look through the folder without saying anything first. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You need to call the police tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight." We called from her landline. The officer who came out was polite, a little confused, took the folder into evidence in a paper bag, and asked me twice if I was sure I hadn't put it together myself for any reason. I said I was sure. He said okay in a way that wasn't really okay, and left. I slept at Warwick that night and the night after. I called out sick from the archive for the rest of the week. When I went back the following Monday, I did it in the middle of the day with a coworker, and I did not go down to the basement alone again for the rest of the month. 2 days after the report, a detective called, then a different detective, then a woman from the state police who asked specific questions about the archive itself, the move, who had worked there in 2015, whether I'd ever noticed anyone around my apartments in the years covered by the schedule. I told her the honest answer, which was no. I hadn't noticed anything. That was the part that took the longest to get used to. Here is what they told me over the next few months. The archive had moved locations in the summer of 2015. During the move, a portion of the visitor logs and access records had been in a set of boxes, confirmed loaded onto the truck at the old building, and confirmed unloaded at the new one. What happened to them between those 2 points, nobody could say. They simply were not in the boxes when the boxes were opened. It had been noted at the time as an administrative loss, and the archive had moved on because it was internal paperwork, not public record. That meant they could not tell me who had been in the building in the months before the move. Not researchers, not staff, not contractors. There were payroll records for staff, but the archive had used a rotating pool of grad student interns from 3 separate universities that year, and the records of who had worked which weeks were incomplete. The photographs couldn't be traced to a specific camera. The handwriting on the schedule didn't match anyone in any employee file they could compare against, which did not mean much because the pool of possible people was already too wide and too undocumented. They kept the case open for about 13 months. Then it was closed. I got a letter. It used the phrase, "no viable investigative leads," and thanked me for my cooperation. I still work in the archive field. Not that archive. I moved out of Providence about a year after all of this, for reasons that were partly about work and partly not. My new place has a camera at the door, and a lock my landlord does not have the code to. The thing I keep coming back to isn't the photos, or the schedule, or even the fact that whoever put that folder together did it before I ever set foot in that building as an employee. It's smaller than that. Somebody, at some point, walked those file boxes onto a truck in June of 2015. Somebody unloaded them at the new building. And somewhere between those two moments, they had the folder about me in their hands, and they made a choice about where to put it back. They put it back. The job was a contract survey for a private client who wanted an updated topographic data set for a stretch of the San Juan Range in southwest Colorado. Nothing dramatic on paper. 2 weeks, drone flights, ground control, some manual traverses in the sections where the tree cover was too thick for clean LiDAR. I'd done a dozen jobs like it before. I was working solo that trip. My usual field partner had backed out 3 days before we were supposed to leave because his kid got sick, and the client didn't want to reschedule. I told the office I could handle it. Alone in that country is not smart, but the weather window was good, and I've spent enough time above 10,000 feet to know how not to die out there. I set up my base camp near a Forest Service road that dead ends about 8 miles south of a town I won't name here. Not because anything happened in the town, just because the area is small enough that if you know the region, you'd know the ridge I'm talking about. I don't want people going up there. The first 4 days were routine. I flew grids in the morning before the wind picked up, ran control points in the afternoon, processed data at night in my truck with a little power bank rig I'd put together. Cell signal was garbage, but I had a Garmin InReach for check-ins with the office. The anomaly showed up on day 5. I was doing quality control on a section I'd flown that morning. When I ran the point cloud through my processing software and pulled up the terrain model, there was a shape in it that made me stop chewing my sandwich. A rectangle, right in the middle of a bowl, at about 11,200 feet, tucked between 2 ridges, perfectly flat. The long axis ran almost exactly north-south. I measured it in the software, 680 feet by 410 feet. The edges were straight, not kind of straight in the way natural benches sometimes look straight. Straight the way a runway is straight. I sat there in the truck for a while. My first thought was that I'd introduced some kind of processing artifact. That happens. Filter settings can flatten out slopes if you screw up the classification. So I reprocessed the raw data from scratch with fresh parameters. Same result. I compared it against the USGS quads for the area. On the quad, that spot is drawn as sloped terrain, with a saddle to the east. No indication of anything flat at all. I pulled up satellite imagery next. Google's coverage of that specific bowl was old and cloudy. The rectangle was there if you squinted, but you'd only notice it if you already knew to look. It read as a slightly lighter patch, like a difference in vegetation, not the kind of thing you'd flag by eye. Historical topos going back to the 70s showed the same sloped terrain the current quad showed. Whatever this thing was, it either post-dated the last field survey of that quad, or it had been drawn out on purpose. Which is a strange sentence to write about a USGS map, but that's where I was. I sat with it for the rest of the evening. There's an obvious next question, which is, who would build a flat rectangle the size of 5 or 6 football fields at 11,000 feet in the middle of nowhere? I ran through the options. Old mining operation, tailings pond that got graded flat. Except the mining records for that district are online, and I checked. Nothing patented anywhere near it. Private airstrip. At that altitude, in that bowl, with no road access anywhere near it. No. Some kind of Forest Service or BLM project. I emailed a guy I know at the state office that night, once I got back into signal range. He wrote back the next morning and said he'd never heard of anything up there, and there were no active permits. That's when I decided I was going to walk in. It took me 2 days to get to it. The bowl has no trail. I parked the truck at a Forest Service gate, hiked 6 miles in on an old Jeep track that turned into an elk trail, camped one night at a small lake below the ridge, and pushed up over a scree slope the next morning. I brought a small hand auger, the kind you use for shallow soil sampling. I also brought my GPS, a camera, and a claw hammer, which I remember thinking was a strange thing to pack. I did it anyway. When I came over the lip of the ridge and looked down into the bowl, I stood there for probably 10 minutes without moving. You could see it. From above, from that angle, in raking morning light, it was as clear as a table set into the mountain, the rectangle. The vegetation on it was different, shorter, sparser. The grass around the edges made an actual line. Not a fuzzy transition, a line. Where the slope of the bowl met the rectangle, there was a subtle rise, maybe 2 feet, like a curb. I walked down. The ground under my boots changed as I stepped over that edge. On the slope, it was normal alpine soil, gravel and root mat, and the springy give you get in the tundra. Half a step onto the rectangle, and the ground was hard. Not frozen hard, hard like a parking lot in summer. My boot didn't leave a print. I stood on it and stomped, feeling like an idiot. It was solid. It didn't ring hollow exactly, but it didn't sound like stomping on dirt either. It was a duller sound than that, something between concrete and packed clay, but not quite either. I walked out to the middle of it. 680 feet is a long way when you're crossing something you can't explain. The wind up there was steady, the way it always is above tree line, and I could hear my own breathing and the click of my boots on the surface. In the very center, I stopped and got down on one knee and looked closely at the ground. There was a thin layer of grit on the surface, wind-blown, maybe a 1/4 inch of it. Underneath, when I brushed it away with my glove, the material was a uniform pale gray-brown. No grain, no pebbles, no plant matter working its way up. Where the sparse grass grew, it was growing in tiny cracks that ran across the surface, and the roots ran sideways because they couldn't go down. I got the auger out. The auger is a T-handle with a helical bit, maybe 3/4 of an inch across. It cuts through packed dirt and clay and even hard soil with a bit of effort. On a good day, I can put it a foot down in a minute. I set the tip on the surface and started to turn. The bit scraped and skittered. No purchase. I put my weight on it. Nothing. I moved to a spot where the grass grew and tried in a crack. The bit slipped sideways and I nearly went with it. I stood up and looked around the rectangle and did something I hadn't planned. I got the claw hammer out of my pack and, feeling stupid, I swung it down onto the surface, hard. There was no chip. The head of the hammer bounced. The surface didn't mark. I did it again, harder. The impact traveled up my arm and set my elbow buzzing. There was a pale scuff where the metal had struck. That was all. I put the hammer back in my pack. The wind kept moving. Nothing else did. There were no animal tracks on the rectangle, and none of the small alpine flowers that grew on the slope around it. I walked back to the eastern edge and stepped off, and the ground gave under my boot again, and I sat down on that little curb of a rise and drank water for a while and tried to think. I did what I was there to do. I ran ground control points on the corners of the rectangle. I took photographs of the edge, of the surface, of my auger tip, of the scuff mark. I noted my elevation and coordinates. I stayed on the rectangle for maybe 2 hours total. I never felt watched. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing dramatic about the place. It was quiet, and it was empty, and it was wrong in a very quiet way. I hiked out the same afternoon, camped again at the lake, was back at my truck the next evening. I finished the rest of the contract in the following week. I flew the remaining grids, ran my remaining traverses, and delivered the dataset to the client. In my report, I included the rectangle as an anomaly requiring further investigation. I attached the point cloud, the photographs, my field notes, and my measurements. I also did something I probably didn't have to do. I filed a formal query with the State Geological Survey, CC'd to a contact I have at USGS, describing the object and asking whether they had records of any known structure or improvement at those coordinates. The response came 3 weeks later, one paragraph, on official letterhead, no signature line, just a printed name and a department code. It said, "The referenced feature is known to the survey. Information regarding this location is restricted at the request of the Department of Defense. No further correspondence on this matter will be entered into." That was all. I've done 4 more jobs in Colorado since then. 2 of them were on the western slope, close enough that on the drive out I could see the ridgeline of that range from the highway. Both times I found myself looking for the bowl, even though you can't see it from the road. Both times I thought about the sound the hammer made when it hit that surface. That flat, dead, quiet little tap. Not concrete, not stone, not anything I've ever put a tool to. The client never asked me about the anomaly section of my report. I checked the delivered data set against a copy I keep on my own drive a few months later, out of curiosity. In the version on the client's server, that section of the point cloud has been resampled. The rectangle is still there if you know how to look. The edges have been softened. It reads at a glance as a natural bench. My copy is on an external drive in a drawer in my office. I haven't looked at it in a while. I know where it is. The knocking is what stuck with me, more than anything I saw later. The rest you can rationalize. The knocking, you can't. I was working the Seagirt terminal in Baltimore that fall, October of 2019. Overnight shift, 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning. 4 nights on, 3 off. I'd been on the job a little over a year at that point. Before that, I did warehouse work in Dundalk. Before that, a stretch in the Army I don't talk about much. The port was fine, quiet, mostly. That was the whole appeal. The way it worked, the terminal was split into sectors, and 2 of us covered the yard at night. I had the north end, closer to the water. A guy named Ray had the south. We didn't see each other for the whole shift, just checked in on the radio every 90 minutes and again at the break. Ray was in his 50s, quiet guy, hunted deer upstate on his days off. If your job is walking around a fenced yard alone in the dark, you want to work with somebody like Ray. That night, the weather was doing the thing it does in Baltimore in October, where the wet off the harbor gets into your coat and stays there. Not cold enough for a real jacket, cold enough to remember it in your knees. I had a thermos of coffee from the Wawa on O'Donnell, half sugar, and I remember I'd left it too long in the guard shack and it was already going lukewarm by my second walkthrough. You have to understand what the yard sounds like at night to get why I noticed anything at all. Even after they shut down active loading around midnight, it's never actually quiet. The cranes settle, metal contracts as it cools. Refrigerated containers, the reefers, run their compressors on cycles, so every 20 minutes or so one of them kicks on somewhere and rumbles for a while. Gulls, the occasional truck on the access road, ship engines from the channel. Your ears learn all of it in the first month, and after that it's just background. The knocking was not background. I was walking down row 14, north to south, about halfway through the second walkthrough of the shift, around 1:30 in the morning. My flashlight was on the ground in front of me, not on the containers themselves, because after a while you stop looking up. I heard something to my right and stopped. It sounded like somebody tapping the inside of a metal wall with their knuckle. Slow, even. Not the random ping of cooling steel, not the buzz of a reefer. It had timing in it. I stood there and listened. First thought was raccoons. We had them in the yard. They got in through the storm drains. They climbed on things. But raccoons don't knock in a rhythm. They scratch and scrabble. This was measured. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. I moved along the row until I was standing next to the container it was coming from. Blue paint, faded, some rust around the lower corner casting. Chinese owner code on the side, but that didn't mean anything. Half the boxes in the yard were Chinese owned, no matter where the cargo started. I pulled out my little clipboard and my flashlight and checked the number against the shift sheet. The box had come in that morning off a feeder ship that made the run up from Norfolk. Original transshipment out of Constanța in Romania. Manifest said automotive parts. Scheduled for a customs exam the next day, around noon. There was a green bolt seal on the door handle, intact, and a customs hold sticker. Everything the way it was supposed to be. The knocking was still going. I put my hand flat on the side of the container. The metal was cold and slightly damp from the fog. I could feel the taps through my palm, faintly, like a small vibration. Not my imagination, physical. I keyed my radio and got Ray. Told him I had something odd in row 14, and could he come up when he had a minute? He said he was finishing a walk on the south end and he'd swing by. Ray didn't ask what. That was one of the things about him. I put my ear against the container. I want to describe this part accurately because I've had to describe it a lot of times since, to a lot of people, and I've noticed the way it comes out changes depending on how tired I am. The truth is, the knocking was closer than I expected, like it was 6 inches from my head, on the other side of the wall. Whoever was doing it was standing right there, and I could hear other sounds too, underneath. Breathing, a shuffle, something that could have been fabric moving. I could not tell how many. It could have been 3, it could have been 30. Sound inside a shipping container does a strange thing. It flattens. Everything comes through like it's underwater. Then the knocking stopped. There was a long pause. Long enough that I started to think I had been hearing things after all, and I was going to feel stupid when Ray came up. I remember I actually took my ear off the metal and stepped back, and I had the thought very clearly that I should just wait for the customs exam in the morning and let somebody else deal with whatever this was. Not my job, above my pay grade, that kind of thinking. I don't know why I put my ear back. The voice was a man's, low and quiet, close to the wall. He had an accent I couldn't place at the time, something Eastern European, careful English like he'd been rehearsing it. He didn't sound scared. He sounded tired in a way that people who are only a little tired don't recognize as tired. He said, "There are 23 of us." That was all. He didn't repeat it. He didn't say anything after. I stood there with my hands still on the container, and I understood, in maybe 2 seconds, everything about what was in that box. Not the details, the shape of it. I keyed the radio without stepping away. I told Ray to call it in, right now, Port Police and Coast Guard, and I gave him the row and the container number, and I told him the word, live. I said it like that. We've got a live box in row 14. He didn't ask me to repeat it. I heard him already moving on his end. Then I did something I still think about, which is, I stayed. I didn't want to walk away from the wall in case the guy inside stopped believing anybody had heard him. I stood there with my forehead against the paint and I said, quietly, "I hear you. Help is coming. Stay quiet." I don't know if he heard me. He didn't answer. Port Police were at the gate in under 10 minutes. Coast Guard was slower, maybe 40. Somewhere in there, a supervisor showed up in his personal car, still in a Ravens sweatshirt, and after him, a customs officer whose name I never got. They didn't want to cut the seal without customs present because of chain of custody. Once he was there, they went fast. I wasn't the one who opened the door. They moved me back to the end of the row. But you can hear a lot from the end of a row. I heard the bolt cutters. I heard the door hinges, which needed grease. I heard a very short silence, maybe 2 seconds, and then I heard a paramedic say a word I won't repeat, but it wasn't a professional word. They brought people out one at a time. I only saw part of it because they set up a screen pretty fast, tarps on stanchions, but I saw enough. Most of them were walking, some weren't. There was a woman being carried out who kept trying to hold on to the arm of the man carrying her, not out of fear, more like she was checking he was real. There was a boy who looked maybe 17. I remember he was wearing a Puma tracksuit and one shoe. One of the medics went in with a bottle of water and came back out with it empty. Went in with another bottle. Same thing. That went on for a while. 19 came out alive. 4 didn't. The 4 were brought out later, after the living ones were gone, in bags. I was told this the next day, officially. I already knew by then. You can tell by how the medics move. The rest of the night is a lot of forms and a lot of the same questions asked by different people. What time, what I heard, what I said, whether I touched anything, whether the seal looked tampered with. It didn't. Whoever loaded that container in Constanza knew what they were doing. I gave a formal statement to a federal agent 2 days later in an office off Pratt Street. Then again a week after that, longer version, with a different agent. The case was a human trafficking case. That word, that's what they called it. I read later that some of the people in the box had been in there since Romania, close to 2 weeks between the ship and the yard. Others had been added at a stop I don't think I'm supposed to talk about. I didn't go back to work at the port. My supervisor called and said take as long as I needed. And about 3 weeks in, I called back and said I wasn't coming. He was decent about it. Ray called me too, once, just to check. He said the yard was different now. They'd put extra cameras in on the east fence and there was a new procedure for suspected live cargo, which they hadn't had before because nobody had ever thought they needed one. We didn't talk long. I still live in Baltimore. I drive past the terminal sometimes on 895. You can see the cranes from the bridge. I don't think about it every time. Most times I do though. I think about the pause between when the knocking stopped and when the man spoke, because that's when he was deciding whether to trust that anybody was actually on the other side of the wall. He was right to try.